Hello everyone and welcome to the second part of my building review series about the diorama with the title The Crash. In the first part we had a very detailed look at the reference materials depicting the incident. Now we get started with the assembly of the models. We will make a few changes and alterations to the kits along the way in order to depict the scene as closely as possible. Let's get started with the assembly of the T-34. The tooling of this kit dates back to 2004 and it's still pretty decent looking. The T-34 kits by Dragon are all pretty well done, you can't go wrong with them. We begin with the lower hull and the suspension springs of the tank. The T-34 had a so-called Christie suspension with its typical big springs inside the crew compartment. The external details of these parts are okay, but all the springs are the same, so in theory we can build the carriage only in its normal position, not retreat it or rebound it. However, we will later see that this is not causing any issues. We don't install the swing arms of the suspension at this stage, instead we continue with various bits and pieces of the lower hull, like the lower rear and front armor plates and the final drive housings. Up to this point everything had a perfect fit and we can continue with the upper hull section. First of all, one should get rid of these ejection pin marks on the bottom sides of the fenders. It is sufficient to simply sand the pin marks off, there's no filling required. The big cover for the rear of the engine deck with the air intake grille comes in two versions with this kit. One version allows us to use a very nicely detailed photo etch grille, the other version is just a single plastic piece. If you don't like to work with photo etched parts, you can go for that. I personally prefer the version with the etched grille. As you can see, the application is quite easy. First I apply some super glue with a toothpick and then I press the grille in its position. The grille gets slightly curved this way, which is exactly what we want. It's not necessary to bend the grille beforehand. Then we add a few photo etched strips on the top part of the grille and glue the entire cover to the upper hull, along with a few other air intakes. Once the rear armor plate is in place, we can put the lower and upper hull together. There are no significant fit issues. Maybe you want to level the joint of the two hull parts in the sponson area a bit. However, it is not worth to actually use a filler here. We move on to the front armor plate. The fenders are molded to the piece, which is not ideal in our case. The fenders get removed with a sharp scalpel blade and they will be replaced by photo etched ones later, because it's easier to reproduce the damage of the crash with PE parts. Then the armor plate gets glued to the model, together with the driver's hatch and the bow machine gun housing. There's also something to do on the rear plate, namely the exhaust system. The exhaust pipes consist of two halves, which is not ideal and requires some additional cleanup work. These two little boxes are meant to go on the rear fenders, but the reference photos of the T-34 I want to depict don't show them. Because of that I leave them off, but the remaining holes in the fenders have to be filled. For this task I am using the Plasto filler by Revell, which I apply with a blunt blade. While the filler is allowed to dry, I remove a couple of molded on details on the sides of the upper hull with a scalpel blade and sanding sticks, because these features are not present on the T-34 I am building. Once this is out of the way, we can also sand off the filler on the rear fenders. After that, I glued on a couple of small parts and tools. The tank looks a bit barren, but that's how the tank appears in the reference photos. For the most part, the hull is finished now and we can continue with the turret. First we assemble the breech of the gun. This area has sufficient detail and will be visible through the open turret hatch later. The gun barrel comes in two halves and I thought about replacing it, but if you glue the two halves together carefully and then sand off the seam lines, you can spend the required money for a metal gun barrel for something else. Now we can build the gun mantlet, which gets glued to the gun breech part, with the turret front piece sandwiched in between. The assembly of the turret is simple. It consists of two halves, a small rear plate, the front plate with the gun and the roof. The fit of the two halves is not really good and the front part requires some gentle persuasion as well in order to fit properly. At least the roof fits in perfectly. The turret hatch is littered with ejection pin marks. Since we want to depict the hatch opened, we have to remove the pin marks. I apply some Revell Plasto filler there and use a very handy 3D printed sanding block, which I received from a great fellow scale modeler recently. The shape of this sanding block allows us to get in all the areas of the hatch without destroying any important detail. Once the sanding process is completed, the hatch gets glued to the turret right away. The fit issues of the turret I have mentioned earlier have led to a few small gaps between the turret front piece and the sides, which I fill up with Mr. Surfacer 500. I apply this stuff with a brush. This completes the turret assembly and we can deal with the remaining parts of the suspension. The sprocket wheels require a lot of cleanup, since there are tons of sprue gates to sand off. The detail in the fit is good at least. Same goes for the front idler wheels, they require careful cleanup as well. I also glue the front axles into the idler wheels at this stage. This is a very important point to keep in mind when it comes to the assembly of many T-34 model kits out there. If you glue these axles to the hull instead, you will have troubles with the tracks. They can be too loose or too tight in the end. You can adjust the tension of the tracks with the axles of the idler wheels, so I advise you to use my procedure. It allows us to adjust the track tension when we have built the tracks and put them on the model to determine the tension. We will get there later in this video. The big wheels also have big sprue gates and require the usual amount of cleanup work, but the assembly is very straightforward. One glues the two wheels together and adds a little cap. Now we get to the swing arms. Here we have to improvise a bit. In the end, the StuG III will be sitting on top of the T-34 front armor plate, so we have to rearrange the suspension of the T-34 a little bit to simulate the extra weight of the StuG III sitting at the front. As we have mentioned before, the kit allows only the neutral position of the swing arms. In order to position the swing arms as we intend, one has to cut off a few pins and knobs on them. The swing arms get glued on with a slow setting glue. For the moment the exact positions are not too important. Just make sure that the general stance of the tank is front heavy. Then I plug on the wheels and adjust the position of the swing arms a bit, so all the wheels actually touch the ground. This way we get a fairly front heavy pose of the tank without too much hassle. We are almost done with the basic assembly of the T-34. Now we can continue with the freehole tracks. For those of you who have not heard of freehole tracks yet, these are individual track links made out of tin, which get linked together with brass wire, and they look very realistic. Unfortunately, these tracks require some preparation, although a lot of scale modelers claim that one can start with the assembly right away. You have to remove the tin flash on every track link, and usually the reboring of the holes for the wire cannot be avoided. This is not a difficult task with the right sanding and drilling tools, but it eats up a lot of time. The assembly works almost the same way as for a real tank track. Each track link gets pinned together with brass wire, the protruding brass wire gets cut off and sanded off. Finally, we apply a drop of superglue to hold the brass pins in place. Here I have installed the tracks to test their length. The ends are held together by a long piece of brass wire. It is easy to see here how the track tension can be adjusted with the idler wheels. Because of that, you should never glue on the axle of the idler wheel before you have assembled the tracks. For now we are done with the assembly of the T-34. The front fenders are still missing and will be added later, using photo etched parts by Aber. We will work on them once the StuG III is fully assembled. All in all, it's a nice kit which caused me little problems and comes with sufficient detail. We could have built the model out of the box if the kit had the right type of tracks. Now we move on to the assembly of the StuG III. This kit is very old now. The original tooling of this kit dates back to the mid-90s and has seen a lot of re-releases over the years. Because of that, the quality is not on the same level as the T-34 kit, but one gets a nice model in the end anyway. First of all, we have to do some surgery on the lower hull tab. We are required to remove the mountings for the front return rollers and the raised markings of the side escape hatches. This is necessary to get all the characteristics of an Ausführung A version right. I simply clip off the return roller mounts and file the remaining material off. New parts for the mountings are included in the kit. Then I sand off the markings for the side escape hatches with the sanding block. Now we can glue on our new return roller mountings. The measurements for their exact location are provided in the instruction, but I do that by feeling. It works good enough. Next we can glue on more parts of the lower hull, like the final drive housing, the rear armor plate with the air intake, the axles for the idler wheels and the exhaust system. At this stage one can also assemble the sprocket wheels, idler wheels, main wheels and return rollers. Of course it is possible to do all of that much later. Unfortunately, the idler wheels are covered with ejection pin marks on their outer surfaces, which should be removed. I simply sand off the pin marks because they are quite shallow. Once this is done, I assemble them and glue them to the hull, alongside the sprocket wheels and the return rollers. Of course you can do this at a later stage of the build as well, it is up to you. This completes the work on the lower hull for the moment, and we continue with the upper hull. Here we have to fill two little indents on the sides of the engine deck. These are meant for the brackets of the antenna holder, but the standard Ausführung A of the StuG III did not have these. However, we will later add one of the antenna holders because it is visible in the reference photos I am using for this build. The brackets for the holder will be photo etch parts, so we do not need such a deep gap to fit them in, so filling the gaps makes sense anyway. Once the filler has dried, we smooth it all out, of course. There's really not much more to do on the upper hull part at this stage, so we glue it to the lower hull. Next we get to the superstructure. Again, we have to do some slicing on the model. One panel of the roof has to be replaced by a different part of the kit, because it does not feature the right characteristics of the Ausführung A. When it comes to old kits like this one, I can accept that, but much more recent kits by Dragon require way more elaborate carving, and that is slightly annoying, especially with a price tag of well over 70 euros. The panel gets removed by repeated cutting with a scalpel blade. A file is used to create a good finish around the edges. Now the new panel can be glued in, but it appears like it's a bit too narrow, or I just cut out too much material. It is not an issue, because I fixed this by gluing in a small part of plastic card, which gets trimmed into its shape and smoothed out with a file. Using filler for this task here is not ideal. Since there's no fighting compartment to worry about, we can glue on the superstructure already. As you can see, it fits on very well. Just be careful when sliding the piece over the gun mount. This is followed by the addition of various superstructure parts, like the front armor plate with the driver vision port or the side armor plates. One can also add the air intakes on the sides and the engine compartment hatches. Although the kit is not up to modern standards, it still builds up well and it's not overly complex. Let's get to the fenders now. Here we have to make some changes to the parts in order to represent some features which are visible in the reference photos. This front fender part here is in the folded up position in the photos, so I cut off the molded on piece and replace it with a piece from the spare parts box. I have built a lot of Panzer III and StuG III models already, so I have a lot of suitable spare parts at my disposal, which makes it easier to make such small but important changes to the old kit. The rear fender flap gets cut off as well, and in its place we glue this trapezoid piece, which also comes from the spare parts box. Now the L-shaped brackets get glued on. These parts were extremely flashy and were tedious to clean up. The kit shows its age here. Before we get to the installation of the fenders, one should close this uncalled for hole in the lower hull. It is hard to reach this place later, so we better do it now. Putting on the fenders is a bit tricky, and I advise you to use a fast setting glue like super glue or Tamiya extra thin. It might be necessary to bend the L-shaped brackets a little bit to ensure a good fit. Next, there's some work to do on the engine deck. According to the instructions, we have to remove a couple of small details there. I simply shave them off with a scalpel, and what is left gets removed with the sanding block. Now we add a few little lifting hooks and the photo-etched air intakes, which come with the kit already. Just like any other photo etch, these get glued down with super glue. The tools of our StuG III kit are pretty crude looking by modern standards and should be improved in some way. I personally prefer to replace the tools completely with better parts, or exchange at least the tool clamps. One can use photo etch tool clamps of course, but I do not really enjoy it to work with such fiddly parts. Instead I just cut off the old tool clamps and insert better ones in their place. For this purpose I simply cut up some spare parts. This is a simple and cheap method to improve your model a lot without spending money on rather expensive aftermarket stuff. The tools are placed on the model as the instructions tell us, because the reference photos show the same arrangement. The gun gets built without any changes. A metal gun barrel is not really required here. You should sand off the seam lines though, which is not difficult to do. After fixing the workable gun mount in its final position, I attach the gun. Although the Ausführung A of the StuG III was not designed with an antenna holder, there's one visible in the reference photos. I assume this device was added to the vehicle sometime during its service life. Unfortunately, the required parts are not all included in the kit, so I had to steal the tray and the photo etched brackets from another kit in my stash. I'm sure such antenna holders are available as an aftermarket piece somewhere, but why should I buy something that I already have somewhere? The kit also doesn't come with an antenna, but Dragon made a set of German vehicle antennas a while ago, which provided a suitable antenna. I decided to build the antenna in a half-raised position, because it adds an interesting look in my opinion. Now we get to the relatively tricky part of assembling the suspension of the Sturmgeschütz. Due to the collision with the T-34, the entire suspension is all over the place and we have to adjust the swing arms accordingly. First I plug the wheels on the swing arms. There is no glue required. The friction alone holds it all in place. Now the swing arms get glued to the lower hull with a slow setting glue, and the StuG III is positioned on the glacis plate of the T-34 in its ramming pose, which makes it easier to determine the positions of the swing arms. Once this is done, it should be allowed to dry for a while. Of course, the two shock absorbers at the front do not fit anymore due to the new positions of the swing arms, and we have to extend them with round plastic bars. To my surprise, the shock absorbers at the rear fit in without any changes. Finally, we add the housings of the shock absorbers and the suspension is done, apart from the tracks. Before we get to the tracks, I want to take care of the stowage. The reference photos show the presence of stowage, but it's hard to see much detail of it, so I am pretty free to glue on the stuff in any way I like it. For that I am using a couple of boxes, tools and jerry cans by several brands. I found that stuff in my spare parts box. One should just keep in mind that everything should look a bit untidy, because the stowage got shaken up by the crash of the two vehicles. In one photo one can see a big tarp which is hanging from the engine deck almost down to the ground. To replicate this I thought of using lead foil, but then I remembered an older technique which also works very nicely. Take one of these microfiber cleaning cloths for glasses, which you might have a dozens at home if you are four-eyed, and cut out a rectangular piece with a sharp pair of scissors. These weird serrated edges are of no use to us and get cut off. Then you soak the piece of cloth with some clear varnish. Both acrylics and enamel paints work, or anything else you might use for scale modeling. The soaked piece of cloth can then be placed on the model in a very realistic way, because it naturally assumes the right shape. Once it has dried, the piece is almost as hard as plastic and the paint sticks to it well. Apart from that, the microfiber texture gives the tarp a very realistic appearance. At this point you can glue on the edges of the superstructure. I decided to show just one edge opened up, because the model does not come with any interior. This is also the right moment to add the conduits for the headlights at the front of the vehicle, using copper wire. Instead of bending the conduits into the right shape and then gluing it on, I prefer a step-by-step approach. I glue on some wire with super glue, then I bend the next section and glue it all in place, and so on. This can avoid a lot of grief. Now we get to the freewheel tracks of the StuG. The wheels get temporarily glued to their axles with PVA glue, so it's easier for us to determine the length of the track by simply putting them on the model. Again, we have to clean up and rebore each track link, just like we have seen before on the T-34. The assembly is also the same procedure. Each track link gets connected with some brass wire, which gets clipped off and sanded, held in place by some super glue. The last stage of the build are the photo etch front fenders of the T-34. I am certainly not an expert when it comes to photo etched parts, but maybe you can learn something anyway. I cut out the photo etched parts with a pair of nail scissors and removed the excess material with a file. It is easier to remove the side panel of the fender, because it's always in the way during the bending process. The longitudinal rib is created with a pen. This works only on a relatively soft mat. Next I try to bend the various curves of the fender piece in a not very professional manner. A pair of tweezers is a useful tool for this. When the shape is right, we glue the side panel back to the main piece and sand down the small curve on the side. Finally, we attach a few reinforcement bars here and there. As I have said before, I am not a photo etch expert, but my result is fairly decent, I think. It doesn't really matter in the end, because I proceed to bend and damage the fenders now, because they got totally crushed in the collision. I will admit that it hurts a bit, but in the end no one will be able to tell that my photo etch skills are not the best. This completes the basic assemblies of the T-34 and the StuG III. I think I managed to capture the essence of the scene fairly well and made some simple but effective changes to the basic kits. My approach should be clear now. First build the T-34 and then you match the StuG III. Maybe you were able to see that even some older kits are a good basis if you are willing to put some extra work into them. Especially the StuG III kit is really showing its age now and requires that special treatment. The T-34 on the other hand is still a lovely kit and even looks good when built out of box today. That's it for this part of the building review series. In the next part we continue with the basic assembly. there's still a motorbike, the figures and the diorama base to do. Thank you very much for watching. See you again in the next video. Your Hamilkar Barkas.